Everything you think you know about Neanderthals might be wrong. For decades, they were dismissed as slow, clumsy, and too primitive to survive. But buried beneath ancient caves, frozen landscapes, and forgotten campsites, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that tells a completely different story. The deeper scientists investigate, the more uncomfortable the truth becomes. Discovery after discovery has forced researchers to abandon ideas that were once treated as fact. Some of the abilities Neanderthals possessed weren't just unexpected. They challenge what it really means to be human. So how did one of our closest relatives become history's biggest loser? And if the evidence has been sitting in the ground all this time, why are so many of us still believing the wrong story? Tonight, we're uncovering 6 of the biggest myths ever told about Neanderthals, myths that collapse under scientific evidence. And by the end of this journey, you may not just see Neanderthals differently. If Neanderthals were really as unintelligent as we've been taught, then there's one question that history struggles to answer. How did they survive for nearly 400,000 years in one of the most unforgiving environments our species has ever known? Ice Age Europe wasn't just cold, it was relentless. Blizzards could last for days. Food could vanish without warning. Massive predators hunted the very same animals Neanderthals depended on to survive. One mistake could mean death. And yet, generation after generation, they didn't disappear. They adapted. They endured. They spread across thousands of miles. That isn't blind instinct. It's intelligence under constant pressure, because surviving a single winter is difficult. Surviving hundreds of thousands of years requires something far greater: planning, cooperation, memory, the ability to solve problems today and prepare for tomorrow. The evidence is everywhere. Archaeologists have discovered that Neanderthals deliberately chose different types of stone depending on the tool they wanted to make. They mastered fire, processed animal hides into useful materials, built specialized hunting weapons, and sometimes carried valuable stone across many miles instead of simply using whatever was nearby. None of those decisions happened by accident. Each one required foresight. But the most remarkable discovery wasn't a tool. It wasn't a weapon. It was a skeleton. Researchers uncovered the remains of several Neanderthals who survived devastating injuries that should have ended their lives. Some lived for years despite damaged limbs, chronic illness, or disabilities that would have made daily survival almost impossible. One famous individual even reached older adulthood after injuries that likely prevented him from hunting at all. Think about what that means. In the Ice Age, every meal mattered, every hunter mattered, every extra mouth was a risk. Yet someone kept feeding them, someone protected them, someone refused to leave them behind. That wasn't survival of the strongest. It was survival through compassion. Suddenly, the image of the savage brute begins to fall apart, because intelligence isn't measured only by bigger brains or more advanced tools. Sometimes it's measured by something far more human: the willingness to care for someone who can no longer repay you. And if Neanderthals were capable of that, then perhaps the greatest misunderstanding wasn't about them. Perhaps it was about intelligence itself, because for generations, we judged an entire species using the wrong definition. And astonishingly, that wasn't even the biggest mistake scientists made. The next myth exists because of a single misunderstanding that fooled the world for decades. Close your eyes and picture a Neanderthal, a heavy brow, bent knees, a curved back, shuffling forward with barely enough intelligence to stand upright. Chances are, that's exactly what you imagined. And that's exactly why this myth became one of the most successful misconceptions in human history. It wasn't born from thousands of fossil discoveries. It wasn't supported by overwhelming evidence. It began with a single skeleton. In the early 20th century, scientists were working with remarkably limited evidence. One nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton became the model for an entire species. There was only one problem. The individual wasn't an average Neanderthal. He was elderly, and he suffered from severe arthritis. His damaged joints twisted the natural posture of his body, making his spine and limbs appear permanently bent. But no one knew that at the time. The reconstruction spread through museums, into textbooks, across newspapers, then documentaries, eventually Hollywood. Within a single generation, millions of people accepted that image as scientific fact. Then more discoveries began to emerge. Skeleton after skeleton was uncovered across Europe and Western Asia. And for the first time, scientists could compare dozens of Neanderthals instead of relying on just one. the picture changed completely. Their posture was upright. Their walk was efficient. Their skeletons were built for covering long distances across rugged landscapes, not dragging themselves forward like apes. Yes, Neanderthals looked different from us, but almost every difference had a purpose. They were shorter, broader, far more muscular. Their wide rib cages supported powerful lungs. Their thick limbs helped conserve heat during brutal Ice Age winters. Even their large noses may have warmed and humidified freezing air before it reached their lungs. What once looked primitive now looks remarkably intelligent. Their bodies weren't evidence of failed evolution. They were evidence of successful adaptation. Evolution doesn't build one perfect human. It shapes different bodies for different worlds. And perhaps the most astonishing part is this. For more than a century, one inaccurate reconstruction shaped how billions of people imagined an entire species. One skeleton, one mistake, one image. Repeated so often, it became common sense. But once scientists realized Neanderthals didn't look like primitive beasts, an even bigger question emerged. If we'd been wrong about what they looked like, what else had we misunderstood? Could they have been thinking in ways far closer to us than anyone had ever imagined? For generations, scientists believed creativity belonged to only one species, Homo sapiens. The reasoning seemed obvious. Art, jewelry, symbols, decoration. None of those things help you catch prey or survive an Ice Age winter. They exist because the mind can imagine something beyond immediate survival. So if Neanderthals never created them, perhaps they never thought that way. It sounded convincing, until archaeology began uncovering discoveries that refused to fit the story. Across several sites in Europe, researchers found carefully modified eagle talons marked with deliberate cut marks. They weren't prepared for food. They appear to have been chosen, shaped, and most likely worn as ornaments. Pause for a moment and imagine that. A Neanderthal deliberately wearing an eagle talon. Not because it helped them hunt, not because it kept them warm, but because it meant something. That tiny object changes the entire conversation. Because before an object can become a symbol, someone has to give it meaning. Perhaps it represented status, perhaps identity, perhaps a spiritual belief. No one knows for certain. But one fact is difficult to ignore. Symbolic behavior requires abstract thought. And suddenly, the line separating them from us becomes much harder to see. Then came another discovery, one that made the mystery even deeper. Deep inside a cave in southern France, far beyond the last trace of daylight, researchers found enormous circular structures built from hundreds of broken stalagmites. They were nearly 176,000 years old, thousands of years before modern humans entered that region. Imagine standing in complete darkness, no sunlight, no landmarks, only the glow of fire. Someone had to carry that fire deep underground, find the location, break apart massive stone formations, transport them, then arrange them into carefully planned circles. No one knows why. Perhaps rituals, perhaps gatherings, perhaps something we've never even imagined. That mystery remains unsolved. But the construction itself tells us something remarkable. Projects like these demand planning, communication, cooperation, and a shared purpose that reaches far beyond simple survival. The more evidence archaeologists uncover, the more difficult it becomes to separate Neanderthals from the qualities we once believed made our own species unique. Because perhaps imagination wasn't invented by Homo sapiens. Perhaps it was inherited from a much older human story. And that leads to the biggest question of all. If Neanderthals were intelligent, if they cared for one another, if they created symbols, if they imagined things beyond survival, then why did they disappear while we survived? The answer is far more surprising than most people have ever been told. It's one of the oldest stories we've ever told about human evolution. Two human species meet, they compete, one wins, the other disappears forever. It's dramatic, it's simple, and according to most modern researchers, it's probably wrong. Around 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals weren't facing just one challenge. They were facing many. The climate shifted again and again. Forests expanded, then disappeared. The giant animals many Neanderthal groups depended on became harder to find, forcing entire communities into unfamiliar landscapes where survival grew even more uncertain. Then another human species entered the story, us. For generations, people imagined what happened next as a brutal war for survival. But archaeology reveals something far more complex and far more human. In some places, modern humans and Neanderthals almost certainly competed for food, territory, and resources. Modern humans may also have carried diseases against which Neanderthals had little natural immunity. At the same time, Neanderthal populations were already small and scattered, making recovery from environmental disasters far more difficult than it was for larger, better connected human groups. No single event explains their disappearance. Instead, many small pressures slowly converged. But perhaps the most remarkable discovery wasn't about conflict. It was about family. Ancient DNA transformed everything scientists thought they knew. Neanderthals and Homo sapiens didn't simply encounter one another. They had children together. That wasn't speculation. It was written into our DNA. Today, most people with ancestry outside sub-Saharan Africa still carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Those ancient encounters left behind a genetic inheritance that survives in billions of people alive today. Some of those inherited genes still influence parts of our immune system and how our bodies respond to different environments. Think about what that really means. Neanderthals didn't simply disappear. Part of them survived inside us. Suddenly, the question changes. Instead of asking, why did humans replace Neanderthals? Perhaps we should be asking, where does one species truly end and the other begin? Evolution isn't a ladder with winners standing at the top. It's a branching tree. Some branches ended, some adapted, some grew apart, and some became part of one another. That's why the story of Neanderthals was never really about extinction. It was about connection, about adaptation, about family, and about discovering that the line separating them from us was never as clear as we once believed. The next time you look into a mirror, remember this. You're not just looking at the story of modern humans. You're looking at one small surviving chapter of the Neanderthals too. If you enjoyed uncovering the myths hidden inside humanity's past, subscribe for more documentaries that separate evidence from assumption and reveal the stories history almost forgot. Because sometimes the greatest discoveries aren't buried beneath ancient stone, they're hidden inside ourselves.